All right. Welcome, everyone, to today's Sims online lecture. My name is Dot Porter, and I am the Sims Curator for Digital Humanities. I am here with my colleagues, Lynn Ransom, Sims Curator of Programs, and Nick Herman, who is the Lawrence J. Schoenberg Curator of Manuscripts. Before I give my official welcome to the lecture, I want to mention, for those of you who aren't familiar, the Schoenberg Institute for Manuscript Studies. We are a research and development group within the Kislak Center for Special Collections, Rare Books, and Manuscripts at the University of Pennsylvania. And we bring manuscripts, technology, and people together. And one of the many things that we do is the Sims online lecture series. We do these monthly, and our next lecture, Grid as Ground, Ruled Lines and Manuscript Images, will be presented by Hannah Vorholt from the University of York. That will be on Friday, April 17th. So keep your eyes open for that if you are so inclined. And I also want to mention that our call for visiting research applications, which is our annual fellowship program, is now open, and they are due on May 1st. So if you want more information about that, please go to our website and take a look. There's some interesting things happening this year that I don't know if I can say, but anyway, go check out our website for our fellowship information. It's very exciting. So now I want to move on and welcome our speaker of today's lecture. So since November of 2021, when our speaker, Siân Echard, presented at the 14th Annual Schoenberg Symposium on the topic of antiquarian avatars of medieval manuscripts, I have been awaiting her book on historical facsimiles with bated breath. That book has now been released, and today's lecture focuses on one of its chapters. But before I say more about that, I'm going to tell you a little bit more about Dr. Echard. Dr. Echard received both her MA and PhD from the Center for Medieval Studies at the University of Toronto, and has spent her entire career since at the University of British Columbia, where she is professor of English and teaches courses on Middle English literature, the Arthurian tradition, medievalism, and book history to both graduate and undergraduate students. She is renowned as both scholar and teacher, having received a UBC Killam Research Prize for 1998, a UBC Killam Teaching Prize for 2001, and being named a Distinguished University Scholar in 2004. She's also served as a member of the Governing Council of the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada, or the SSHRC, which is their funding body for governmental funding body for the humanities. So that's quite a prestigious position to hold. Although today's talk focuses on her work in manuscript studies and book history, that is not her only research interest. As detailed by William Green, Daniel Helbert, and Noel Phillips in their introduction to Textual Traditions and Medieval Literary Culture, essays in honor of Siân Echard, which was published last year by Boydell and Brewer, her work spans, quote, from the poems of John Gower to Arthurian matter and early British historiography to the study of early printings of medieval texts to 19th century medievalism. They continue to explain that these areas of interest aren't considered by Dr. Echard in isolation. Quote, the beauty of Echard's scholarship is the way it reveals so many meaningful connections between what appear to be separate areas of study. And this brings me back to Dr. Echard's current book, which connects medieval manuscripts to the growth of photographic and other reproductive technologies of the 18th and 19th centuries. Facsimile, Making Likeness and Medieval Manuscripts, the book I have been waiting for, and which is described on Penn Press's website as, quote, an unprecedented cultural history of reproductions of medieval manuscripts. In this book, Dr. Echard discusses various pre-digital reproductions of manuscripts, how they affected the people who made and used them in the past, and how they continue to influence the way we think about medieval manuscripts today. Today's talk, One Sober Tint, Facsimiles of Illuminated Manuscripts and the Problems of Color, focuses on the chapter of that book that is on the topic of color. Welcome, Dr. Echard. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you. Thanks, Dot. Okay, so now we switch over so I can share my screen. Yes? All right, this is the moment of truth. Okay, and then I come over here. All right. I don't see, hang on. This is not what is supposed to be happening at the moment. I'm going to stop the share and go back. Just a sec.
That was like a nice little preview.
Well, it was, but it was sort of cheating. We tested this. It worked just fine. So what's happened? Ugh. All right, hang on. I now have a blank screen. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yeah.
but we can't
We can
see
hear
your
you.
presentation.
No, I know. I can't see anything either. This is a total mystery. All right. I'm going to try. Okay, I'm hitting share screen again, but I don't seem to have a screen to share. It says I'm screen sharing, but it won't
That
let me.
shows
I
we
know,
see
but it
the
won't let me control my slideshow. This is the problem. Okay, no, there, wait, we've got it. All right, nobody breathe. Nobody do anything. Thank you. Let us hope that whatever just happened doesn't happen again. And thank you, everyone, for bearing with the rather messy opening. And obviously, thank you to Lynn and Dot and Nick for the invitation and arranging things. And also, thank you for the wonderful poster, both because it's beautiful and because it gives me my opening for today. So, the library catalog says that this illuminated vignette may be the work of the Italian copyist Ernesto Sbrega from around 1850. The source is the Bible of Borso d'Este, a magnificently illuminated Italian manuscript of the mid-15th century. And the facsimilist has reproduced the vase and parts of the floral decoration from the border on the left, so bottom left corner. You can see that the facsimile's version of the bush on the left is not an exact match to the manuscript. I suspect because the facsimilist is also removing the perspectival ledge and creating a straight base for an image that's now centered for its contemporary viewer. The copy has also filled out the flourishing and removed both the border bar on the left and the impinging text block on the right, again, reframing the copied element as complete and freestanding. This approach to the illuminated manuscript page, the clipping of elements, the tidying of what remains to match the facsimilist's conception, is typical of much 19th century copying from illuminated manuscripts. The hand painting, too, is a well-established approach and was one solution to what I'm calling the problem of color. The Victorian Albert has several copies firmly attributed to Sbrega in its collection. What you're looking at here is a copy that he made around 1862 from the Siena choir books. The initial is removed from the music which it initially introduced. This one's a copy from another 15th century choral book, again with the music removed, and this time with a decorative element on the top that's been taken from another folio in the manuscript. Sbrega made these and other copies of Italian work for the Arundel Society's 1862 publication, an alphabet of capital letters selected from the illuminations of Italian choral books of the 15th and 16th centuries. The Arundel Society was founded 1848-1849 to spread knowledge of fine art, partly through its publication of reproductions, like this collection of initials. The title page notes that the illustrations are engraved in outline. And you can see here how Sbrega's color copy has become the basis for a monochromatic line engraving. If we zoom in on the title page, we can see that the reader is also promised, down at the bottom there, one letter printed in colors. And this is that letter, presented as the frontispiece to the book. The technology used to produce the color is chromolithography, which by 1862 was widespread in all manner of color reproductions, including facsimiles of illuminated manuscripts. But not everyone approved of the results, and indeed suspicion of color, expressed in terms of the inadequacy of various technologies to deliver it faithfully, does not dissipate in professional academic circles until well into the 20th century. The problem of representing color in medieval manuscripts has been a constant preoccupation of both users and producers of facsimiles, and this isn't merely a technical issue. Color is a site that exemplifies the tensions that have long existed in facsimile. It's a place where we can see conflicting ideas about what fidelity and exactitude mean, and perhaps what they're for. In writing my book, I didn't start with a definition of facsimile beyond observing, as in the title, that the word's Latin roots point to both making, facio, and likeness, similis, suggesting that process matters as well as results. Instead, I took facsimilists at their word. If they said that they were producing facsimiles, and if they called their work, as they tend to do, faithful or exact or accurate reproductions, then I tried to figure out what those terms meant to them. In my talk today, I want to survey how facsimilists from the 18th to the early 20th centuries approach the question of color. Color is a place where technology, audience, and imagination intersect in ways that can tell us much about how people related to the medieval manuscript book. One of the ideas about faithful reproduction across the period I'm dealing with has to do with creating an image that would connect a viewer to an object of the past. Such connection is felt to require an involvement of a viewer's imagination and emotions. And color, even when it's not present on the page, is part of harnessing those crucial elements. Thomas Frognall Dibdin, who possesses one of my favorite names of all time. I want to get a dog and call it Frognall, little dog. Thomas Frognall Dibdin was a bibliophile and bibliographer who wrote several lavishly illustrated books about books, the most famous of which is probably his Bibliographical Decameron of 1817. And the conceit of the book is that a book lover, Philemon, takes his friends through a tour of illuminated manuscripts and early printed books. The conversation between Philemon and his friends is paralleled by an authorial voice in the lavish footnotes, in which Dibdin often expands on Philemon's remarks and also makes specific reference to the many reproductions with which the book is illustrated. My title for today comes from one of those footnotes. Philemon has been discussing the Bedford Hours, called in those days the Bedford Missal, focusing on this page with its portrait of John, Duke of Bedford. Philemon directs his audience to admire the copy he had made of the portrait of Bedford, and his interlocutors are suitably impressed, calling the image most singular, most splendid, and most interesting. Lorenzo, who speaks these words, might of course be imagining the manuscript original, but the point is that he can do so only through the medium of the facsimile. Furthermore, throughout the Bibliographic Decameron, the facsimiles themselves are repeatedly framed as objects of admiration in their own right, through the authorial footnote voice that at times all but takes over the page. And this is an example of what that looks like. What Dibdin is discussing here is a previous attempt to reproduce pages from the Bedford Hours. He's referring to Richard Gough's 1794 study of the manuscript, which was one of the first full-length studies of a single illuminated manuscript. It was illustrated with 4 engraved plates, 1 of text and 3 of illuminations. Dibdin criticizes the plates of illumination for being, he says, only an outline, with a prodigious deal of the characteristic ornaments of the original wholly omitted. Now, comparing the two, you can see that this seems a bit rich, while Dibdin's own facsimile omits the border of the manuscript page entirely. So what can he mean by his criticism of the truth of Gough's plate? For Dibdin, fidelity here is not about the exact reproduction of every element on the manuscript page. Instead, it's about the quality of the reproduction as he understands quality. And that has to do in part with the handling of color. After praising the engraving by George Lewis, Dibdin goes on to note, I'm aware that there are some few copies of Mr. Gough's book with the plates colored, but these I have always considered as the sorriest possible representation of the originals. Who of the modern sons of men could successfully imitate the delicate hues, the radiant colors, and the dazzling gold of this wonderful volume? The attempt would be either folly or madness. Therefore it is that one sober tint, either brown or black, is more satisfactory than the piebald colors of an indifferent modern illuminator. Dibdin's reflecting the fact that in his period, and indeed before, if color were to be added to an illustration, it would be by hand. This was a well-established and usually professional process. Publishers from the early modern period onwards made some books available either in monochrome or with their illustrations hand-tinted. And this one's from my university library's own copy of Conrad Gessner's 1551 Historia Animalium. The work of hand painting could be hastily or carefully done. Gessner's publisher charged almost 3 times the price for the colored version, so the work is pretty good. But there is a difference between coloring a picture of a moose and adding color to what is presented as a faithful copy of a manuscript original. Dibdin's worries suggest concerns both about the available materials and the necessary skills to add color successfully. But color was central to how people thought about and related to illuminating manuscripts. This, for example, is Dibdin's plate of initials from a 15th century copy of the Decameron, now Bodley and Holcomb Miscellaneous 49. As with the engraving of Bedford, Dibdin praises the skills of his engraver and explicitly argues that the facsimiles exhibit almost the brilliant hues of the originals, something he attributes to good engraving and good printing. Still, there's a clear awareness that something is missing. Dibdin goes on to observe that in the absence of those colors which diffuse so joyous a luster over the original, it is perhaps difficult, if not impossible, to convey an adequate idea of the extreme beauty of the whole. But it should be noticed that in the opposite plate, the first figure is clothed in a lilac dress, the second in blue, the third in green, the fourth in green, the fifth in crimson, and the sixth in green. Notice that Dibdin does not describe all of the colors. Here, for example, you can see that the figure in the portrait, so that's the second in the top row, is indeed clothed in blue, but no mention is made of the green letter or the bright red ground. Like many bibliophiles of the time, Dibdin often gravitates towards representations of human figures. Recall as well his excerpting of the portrait of Bedford from the frame of the manuscript page. In this case, Dibdin also notes that there is an apparent truth or individuality about these portraits which makes one believe that they are not entirely fictitious. Yet, even if the figure, the portrait, is central and the engraving excellent, a reader is also imagined to need or want information about color. Throughout the Bibliographical Decameron, Dibdin's extensive discussion and praise of his reproductions moves these facsimiles into occupying almost the same space of desirability as their source. That desirability results from both the charisma of the source material and the excellence of its reproduction. The monochrome reproduction is paradoxically an example of such excellence precisely in its rejection of poor color reproduction. And yet color haunts reproduction and Dibdin's discussion of it, as he repeatedly uses the language of light and brilliance in unpacking the relationship between reproduction and original throughout his book. Take, for example, his description of Bodley 264, a magnificent 14th century illuminated copy of the Roman d'Alexandre. The manuscript was a favorite source for facsimilists of the 18th and 19th centuries. The engraver and historian of costume Joseph Strutt created many plates like this for his sports and pastimes of the people of England by grouping the bas de page illustrations of Bodley 264 into thematic groups. This one is tricks taught to horses. The artist and antiquarian Henry Shaw, someone I'll be talking about more in a moment, often used initials and decorative elements from period-specific manuscripts to embellish the pages of his books, as here when he includes a clip from Bodley 264 as part of a discussion of Ricardian fashion in his dresses and decorations of the Middle Ages. And Dibdin himself illustrated his Bibliographical Decameron with black and white line engravings like Shaw's from the base of Bodley 264's pages. Here, 2 figures from folio 59 recto are rearranged, one above another, both of them on top of a group clipped from folio 68 recto. The viewer is invited into different kinds of engagement with these illustrations. Footnote Dibdin calls the bottom image an example of the numerous drolleries to be found in the manuscript, suggesting a position of detached amusement. I'm reminded of Strutt's slightly desperate designation of multiple plates in his sports and pastimes as representing games unknown. But of the top vignette, Dibdin remarks, quote, on the several representations of a tender cast of character, adding, take the following, gentle-hearted reader, from the same representations, and draw what inference seemeth best to thee. So here there's an invitation to using the manuscript image as a point of imaginative contact, feeling one's way into the past. The contact here is invited through the medium of this black and white line drawing, but it's clear that for Dibdin, the glorious color of the manuscript page also matters. Here he is introducing Bodley 264. Let the day be ever so dark, let the wind blow ever so coldly through the crevices of the mullions or the panes of glass in that vast book repository, you have here a luminary whose rays darting upwards equally diffuse light and heat. These rays animated Tom Wharton, and they even warmed John Price, and certainly in one of the coldest of the early November days, these same rays caused the blood of the writer of this most strange note to glow as if the thermometer were at 72 in a northern aspect. So Dibdin imagines the dark, chilly library populated with men like him. The literary historian Thomas Wharton, the antiquarian and librarian John Price, basking in the incandescent glow of the medieval manuscript. Language supplies what technology cannot, painting the reader's imagination with the golden glow of the manuscript's illumination. Gold, indeed, is a particular and explicit issue when facsimilists consider color. Dibdin devotes some 8 pages in the first volume of the Bibliographical Decameron to the Benedictional of St. Ethelwold, the 10th century English manuscript that's now British Library Additional 49598. Dibdin describes the manuscript as being perfectly in a blaze with illuminations. And here, both Philemon in the main text and Dibdin in the footnotes frame gold as one of the volume's defining characteristics. Other facsimilists similarly remark on the gold, whether they reproduce the color or not. The antiquarian John Gage Rookwood wrote a lengthy essay on the manuscript, illustrated with 30 high-quality engravings. This one's a typical plate for the period, combining facsimile samples from several folios with an alphabet based on the text. The top facsimile comes from folio 6 recto, and you can see another standard approach at the time in the cleaning up of the show-through. The letter is much more defined as a result, but we still have to be told about the gold that we cannot see. Rookwood's description of the gold is matter of fact, gold leaf laid upon size, solid and bright. More animated, perhaps, is the text accompanying Henry Noel Humphreys's chromolithograph of one folio of this manuscript for his 1849 Illuminated Books of the Middle Ages. Here, the manuscript's coloring is characterized as rich but chaste and with masses, judiciously introduced, but still masses, of burnished gold. This photo is from my library's copy of Humphreys, and it gives just a bit of the sense of the gold that was used quite lavishly in the facsimile. As Dot Porter's remarked, you really need to move pages in the light to get the full effect of gold. But even with full color reproduction and gold leaf, the text still works hard to conjure beyond the image, to give a sense of the original splendor. And like many facsimiles of the time, it's also quite happy to repair damage to the original, here restoring a lost corner. John Obadiah Westwood, one of the most prolific facsimilists of the 19th century, included this plate from the Benedictional in his facsimile of the miniatures and ornaments of Anglo-Saxon and Irish manuscripts, and again linked the manuscript's magnificence to its gold-embellished letters and pictures. These help to make the manuscript, as he puts it, noble and grand. Both Humphreys and Westwood offer their audiences gold and color within the limits of chromolithographic technology, but they also use text to enhance the sense of the volume's splendor. And here we may return to Dibdin for a final set of comments on the manuscript that illuminate, how color intersects with expectations and experiences of the medieval manuscript, even when color reproduction's not on offer. The last reproduction that Dibdin offers from the Benedictional is this one, from folio 118 verso, so towards the end. In the manuscript, the figures on this folio are not all overpainted, as they are elsewhere. Philemon notes that, quote, unluckily, these compositions, he's talking here about the whole manuscript, are colored over with a thick body of paint approaching to the consistency of oil color. However, the last page of the volume furnishes us with a specimen of this outline, yet not free from injury. Rookwood's essay on the manuscript quoted at length the negative assessment of William Young Otley, who commented on, quote, the deficiency of beauty in the heads amounting to positive ugliness, which appears to be in a great measure occasioned by the difficulty which the artist encountered in his attempts to finish them with body colors. So the overpainting wasn't in line with the taste of the time. Rookwood chose this same incompletely painted image for his only color reproduction, noting that the quality of the drawing could best be seen in this image. Canons of taste at the time, as Charlotte de Noël has demonstrated, led early 19th century art historians to dismiss much early European manuscript illumination, and so Dibdin's choices and commentary can be understood in part in terms of that context. The manuscript's final image is not completely colored, and in Dibdin's outline reproduction, it is further drained of color so that the viewer can admire what Philemon calls the spirit and truth of the composition, which inheres, it seems, in the underlying drawings of faces and hands and draperies, rather than in the painting. But characteristically, Dibdin manages to have it both ways. Even as Philemon is rendering his considered judgment on the pigment's flaws, the footnotes describe the manuscript as being perfectly in a blaze with the illuminations of the latter part of the 10th century and calls this picture of the Marys at the sepulchre a blaze of splendor. The whole book, meanwhile, is presented as the site for some pretty intense antiquarian pleasure. The vellum is thick but soft, and the gold is of particular purity and consistency. This glorious book is a very harvest field for the antiquary to disport himself in. Well then, the point is that Dibdin's pages, with their multiple voices, present what we tend to think of as separate stances. The academic, observational, disciplinary, professional stance on the one hand, and the amateur, and remember the word comes from amo, amare, to love, the amateur enthusiast on the other. But these voices both emanate from the same man and from a time when the book-related disciplines were only beginning to be established. I want to move now deeper into the 19th century and consider another highly influential facsimilist, the engraver, artist, and antiquarian Henry Shaw. Henry Shaw began his professional interactions with medieval artifacts as an engraver whose early work included the illustrations accompanying Frederick Madden's 1833 illuminated ornaments selected from manuscripts and early printed books. By 1842, he was writing his own books, including his Encyclopedia of Ornament, followed the next year by Dresses and Decorations of the Middle Ages. He became a significant transmitter of the medieval world to a Victorian audience, not only through his books, to which we'll turn in a moment, but also through his hand-painted leaves, copied from medieval manuscripts. You're seeing here that familiar portrait of the Duke of Bedford from the Bedford Hours, this time in a leaf that Shaw painted in the 1860s for his wildly popular exhibition of facsimile leaves in London in 1866. These leaves were eventually purchased by the South Kensington Museum, now the V&A, to serve as examples for art students. Shaw's leaves are remarkable and wide-ranging. This one is the opening of Mark from the Knut Gospels, an early 11th century English manuscript. And these are two of several leaves he copied from a 16th century French book of hours from the workshop of Jean Baudichon. So these are my own photos, and the colors in gold are more brilliant than in the official images that one can download of some of them from the V&A's website. And I'll return to the question of digital color as a coda to today's talk. But I want to focus here on the times that Shaw decided against color. As I've noted, in 1817, Dibdin's championing of one sober tint was in part about making a virtue of necessity. But as Shaw's career reached its height, color was more readily available to him than it had been to Dibdin. He did produce and sell books with colored reproductions, experimenting with both chromolithography and hand painting, though both methods carried out to his standards rendered his books quite expensive. His 1845 alphabet book, for example, although it sold for the princely sums of 2 guineas for imperial octavo and 4 for imperial quarto, did not, Rowan Watson writes, recoup enough money to offset the costs of production. But this volume was not entirely in color, and in the preface, Shaw noted that the engravings were, quote, colored where necessary to imitate the originals. Necessary seems to mean when copying from manuscripts, as here, as opposed to early print, which is rendered in black and white. Alphabets copied from monuments are rendered in 2 colors, with black on shades of brown for stone and yellow-brown on black for brass, as here in the alphabets based on the tombs of Richard II and Henry VII in Westminster Abbey. There's a suggestion of verisimilitude in the general coloring, though there's no attempt to represent the actual state of the letters in terms of the weathering to which they've been subject. Recall the other facsimiles we've seen that silently erase damage in order to reproduce not the current state of their originals, but rather an undamaged, imagined, pristine state. That state's also more useful for Shaw's audience than a completely accurate copy of the inscriptions as they are. The color, and in the Henry VII alphabet, shaded initials and cross-hatched ground, bring out the fine details of lettering for an imagined audience of artisans. The point here is not to show what the inscription looks like now, but rather to offer models for crafting new letters in an accurate medieval mode. If Dibdin's descriptions of color serve to spark the imagination, then Shaw's choices seem to be dictated by a pragmatic, utilitarian approach. That approach can also be detected in one of Shaw's entirely monochrome publications, his 1866 Handbook of the Art of Illumination. By 1866, the choice of monochrome engraving was something of an outlier for a book of this sort. It was remarked on in reviews. And Shaw's opening words make that clear. Considering the great number of books of every degree of merit on the art of illumination which have appeared of late years in both England and on the continent, and on many of which all the resources of chromolithography have been employed in attempts to produce facsimiles of the beautiful originals from which their illustrations have been taken, it may fairly be asked whether another publication on the subject is required. Shaw's answer is yes, and he gives two reasons. The first is economic. The best color reproductions are too expensive for ordinary people. And Shaw's attempting both to form general taste and to instruct modern artists pursuing medieval styles and techniques. The second reason is technological. Modern pigments cannot successfully transmit the necessary gradations of color, and the substitutes that have to be used in the place of real gold fade when exposed to the light and become a dull, heavy mass. And so, like Dibdin before him, Shaw asserts the superiority of monochrome reproduction, in his case via wood engraving. He argues that wood is preferable to metal because impressions from its flexible surface were richer in tone than those produced from the hard lines of metal. And this is a detail of the engraving from the Canute Gospels, and I showed you his full-color hand-painted leaf. Many of the leaves that Shaw painted for this exhibition that then subsequently went to the South Kensington Museum were also the basis for the illustrations in his books. This example from an 11th century gospel book of Echternach is accompanied by instructions on how a viewer is to interpret the shading. In the following engravings, whenever flat tints are shown in gradations, the lightest is intended to represent gold, the next green, the following red, and the deepest blue, or sometimes purple. So here he's not just listing colors, as facsimilists often did to supply what was missing in their reproductions. He's suggesting that the viewer perform an act of visual mental translation. Comparing the engraving to the original shows just how exquisite and careful Shaw's work is, and comparing a cheap chromolithograph from around the same time in a popular 1860 Handbook of Illumination makes one sympathetic to Shaw's concerns about poor reproduction. Still, I'm thinking about the impulse behind and the implications of Shaw's descriptions of color. The more minutely Shaw describes the color of his sources, the more a gap or tension can develop between the conjured image and the engraved plate. Here he is describing this glorious engraving of the Beatus page from the Psalter of Robert de Lindsay. Between the outer ornamental border and the letter, the ground of a dark color, usually blue, was elaborately diapered. The letter itself was composed of the most delicate and intricate interlacings of small bands of light brown, green, and blue alternately. Entangled in the folds are found dogs, rabbits, squirrels, and other animals. These, like the figures in the medallions, are on raised and burnished gold grounds. All these details are surrounded by a clear and intensely black outline, evidently composed of lamp black and gum. Now, I'm excerpting here. He describes the original at even more intricate length. Is there a tension between the insistence on what good engraving can do, matched with a well-instructed and imaginative reader, and the awareness of what nevertheless cannot be shown? Shaw, remember, also painted and exhibited full-color leaves at pretty much exactly the same time that he was working on the handbook, and one of his subjects was the Beatus page. Here, with a description, so this was used as one of the posters for the exhibition, telling people what they were looking at. He describes it as one of the finest examples of English art at the beginning of the 13th century, now in existence. And he goes on to note the great spirit with which the dogs and rabbits are drawn. Spirit is another word that might suggest a kind of connection, imagined connection, between artist and viewer. Now, I've seen Shaw's facsimile in person. This is my photograph, but I've never seen the Lindsay Salter. It's fully digitized, but I have no way of knowing whether the rather lugubrious and spiritless image on the right is the result of the modern equivalent of bad chromolithography or just the passage of time. Facsimilists, remember, often cleaned up their copies as if fidelity meant showing the object as it had been. In a way, putting Shaw's facsimile and the digital version of the original together once again requires the kind of imaginative effort that so many of the facsimilists I've been looking at undertake themselves and expect of their viewers. The facsimile is a window into the past. How we see through it is partly conditioned by technology, but also by all the assumptions and tastes and ideas that we bring to the use of that technology. I suggested that some part of Shaw's audience and his own stance is what we might think of as professional or disciplinary. While he was undoubtedly feeding a popular taste for medieval decoration in Victorian England, he was also, like some of the other facsimilists I've been discussing, contributing to what would eventually become disciplines like paleography or codicology or art history. His sample leaves connected institutions together, as he made objects in, let's say, the British Museum Library available to students at the South Kensington Museum. Facsimiles have long played a role in the institutional tension between protecting artifacts and allowing for their study. A facsimile can protect its source from being, in the words of one French archivist in 1940, handled by too many hands and too often without respect. The French says that the manuscripts are in danger of being feuilletés, which has a kind of dismayed suspicion of users that it's hard to translate. But if illuminated manuscripts are understood in terms of their splendid colors and shining gold, can a monochrome reproduction ever serve as a substitute, or indeed as a reasonable representation for study as well as for amateur appreciation? Chromolithography was ubiquitous, as I've said, by the time Shaw rejected its use in his handbook. There was also a new technology emerging that again raised the question of what a reproduction was meant to show and to whom. In 1864, Shaw attended an exhibition by the London Photographic Society of photographs from miniatures from the Grimani Breviary, taken by Antonio Perini in 1862, and there's an example on this slide. Shaw was unimpressed, writing, quote, "Although these photographs give the character of the heads and the general composition of the designs in a satisfactory manner, they fail to convey any clear idea of the brilliancy and beauty of the colors employed, especially in the exquisite and varied borders surrounding the heads, in most of which gold is made a leading feature." Here would seem to be a position completely contrary to the one he would take just 2 years later in his handbook. Indeed, he goes on to note that the deficiencies of the photographs are partially made up for by the presence in the exhibition of one chromolithographed page. But Shaw's writing in a period of transition, when multiple modes of reproduction were available, each with their own affordances and limitations, so it's not surprising to see him going back and forth. Manuscript custodians were among those choosing between those modes. And despite the doubts expressed by Shaw, photography would come to be extremely important in the study of medieval manuscripts. And the question of color in this new medium was the topic for discussion and disagreement, often along the lines of assessments of earlier technologies such as chromolithography. The British Museum began publishing photographs of its manuscripts in the last quarter of the 19th century. Its publication of English charters in 1873 was explicitly dedicated to preservation, exact imitation. And photography is here imagined as both exact and requiring no human manipulation. The particular form that they've chosen to use means that the copy is going to be untouched by the hand. The photographs are monochrome, and there's no discussion of color, presumably because of the nature of the originals. But there's still a recognition of the ineffable appeal that characterizes the discussion of illuminated manuscripts as well. The charters, the preface asserts, quote, cannot be looked on without emotion, as monuments of a remote age. So, the exactness of photographic reproduction and preservation marches hand in hand with the affective appeal of the originals. Just as Shaw could not resist conjuring color in his prose, even when not reproducing it visually. The British Museum did venture into color reproduction, similarly combining appeals to exactness with various kinds of imaginative responses. The preface to George Warner's 1903 publication of a portfolio of chromolithographic plates from illuminated manuscripts notes that the full effect of illumination can hardly be realized without golden color, and it was therefore resolved to preserve these essential features so far as it can be done by mechanical means. With this object, chromolithography, based, of course, upon photographs, was selected as the process of reproduction. So photography by this point is the, of course, they're using photographic negatives to construct the lithographic stones. It's the underlying basis for faithful reproduction, but the preface also acknowledges the human hand and eye, in this case of the English pioneer of chromolithography, William Griggs. The reproductions have been made by Mr. William Griggs, to whose patience and skill, aided by careful collation, they owe whatever measure of success can be claimed for them. And the facsimile you're seeing here is taken from Harley 2788, the Harley Golden Gospels, another prestige manuscript often featured in facsimiles of the period. This is the Liber Generationis page as it appears in Humphreys's illuminated books on the left, and in another of Shaw's hand-painted leaves on the right. The text accompanying the British Museum's chromolithograph actually warns against Humphrey's version of the Matthew portrait, which you're seeing here, saying that it is, quote, not quite trustworthy, which seems particularly cheeky, as Warner also notes of the museum's own reproduction that in the original, some of the rays, which are laid on in leaf and vary alternately in tint, as here represented, extend by accident on the hair and cheek. This fault has been corrected in the plate. And you can see here what the text is referring to on the left of the face and the halo. So we've seen examples of the quiet cleaning up of show through, or the restoration of damage. But in this case, the reproduction corrects what is presumably a point of production error. So replicating not just the first state of the object, but its imagined perfection in the face of human imperfection, this time of the medieval artist, rather than the modern chromolithographer. The modern chromolithographer fixes what the medieval artist got wrong. There's also probably a quiet correction here of a tear in the border. So you can see that little nick, and it's not visible in the chromolithograph. The earliest surviving photographic negatives of the folio date to the early 20th century, and they show this damage. So it probably was present in 1903 when the chromolithograph was made. Here, in this case, we're restoring the border to what it might have been before the ravages of time. So this plate shows an oscillation between different ideas of what original and faithful reproduction might mean. And color is the backdrop against which the push-pull between reproduction and restoration plays out. Gold, as I've already noted, was a particularly challenging color or material. The 1903 chromolithographs used gold leaf, Warner observing in his introduction that this was the only suitable material to avoid the dullness which we've heard Shaw, among others, complain of. I love as well the idea that you have to avoid fugitive pigments. The whole thing makes it sound as though bad reproduction is also actually criminal in some way. Warner also had embossing added to some of the plates, as here in this plate from Cotton Caligula A7. And you can see from my photograph of the rear of the plate the impression left by the embossing. So this facsimile has a tactile as well as a visual dimension. Again, the chromolithograph has removed the signs of wear from the original, but this attempt at harnessing both sight and touch suggests a need to stretch beyond visual reproduction. The embossing was, as Warner's preface acknowledges, a laborious process. And the British Museum's other publications make clear that institutions had a range of approaches when it came to reproducing manuscripts in their collections. In addition to the 1903 chromolithographs, the museum also published a series of photographic collections based on its manuscripts, and these were in black and white. This plate from Arundel 60 appears in the second series of reproductions from Illuminated Manuscripts, 1907. These colotype reproductions, so this is another early photographic process, were produced at more or less the same time as the chromolithographs. And in fact, Warner's commentary on the monochrome plates in these publications often refer the reader to that color series. His introduction notes that gold, color, and scale are all lost here. But you can see that he still maintains the educative value of the series. It gives a fairly comprehensive view of medieval miniature painting. The colotype plates successfully reproduce detail and tonal variation, and for that reason, many art historians and manuscript scholars preferred this kind of reproduction for the purposes of study and education to what was then available in terms of color reproduction. The 1903 chromolithograph series did not reproduce this crucifixion. Instead, it featured the recto of the same opening, so psalm text, with an elaborate initial and border. In the notes to the chromolithograph of that psalm page, Warner alerts the reader that the crucifixion folio has been reproduced in colors by Westwood, but not quite satisfactorily. Both giving the curious consumer a reference point, Westwood's 1868 collection of facsimiles from Anglo-Saxon and Irish manuscripts, and then taking it away by doubting its accomplishments. Not wanting to leave his reader behind, however, Warner then describes the crucifixion folio, and remember, it's not being pictured at all in this case, in some detail. The cross is of 2 shades of slate blue with a narrow border of brick red bearing a white key pattern. The Savior's body is much emaciated, the knees are bent, the feet nailed to a board, the head resting on the right shoulder. Head, that should say. The flesh tints are opaque and in streaks, and on each cheek is a red patch. The pale yellow nimbus bears a blue cross with a black border studded with white beads. The waistcloth is blue and brown and has an ornamental beaded border. Again, a reader's imagination is enlisted, and much in the way that medieval mystics conjured very vivid pictures of the crucifixion as part of their practice. Some of the language that's used to describe the image and color might also serve to move a reader emotionally. The description of the monochrome colotype version says only that this image is in body colors, which is quite a different level of detail and invitation. Recall that Warner presented the colotypes with reference to manuscripts in the public display and to the British Museum's guide to that display. It would seem that a public audience is being imagined as the purchasers of the colotype plates, perhaps as souvenirs or vademecum. And I'll close in a moment with monochrome photography aimed at precisely that purpose, like explicitly. But first, I'd like to return briefly to the fact that, as I've said, scholars well into the 20th century preferred monochrome photographic reproduction to color, chromolithography at first, and then eventually color photography, arguing that it could do a better job of transmitting fine detail. While the British Museum Library's publications in the early part of the 20th century featured sample pages from a range of manuscripts, the Bibliothèque Nationale in Paris produced series devoted to multiple images from single manuscripts. These too were colotype images, phototypes, printed on individual cards, accompanied by a descriptive pamphlet. This slide shows the 1911 publication devoted to Latin I, the first Bible of Charles the Bald. And you can see that it includes cards of the miniatures and of the initial letters. This kind of portfolio printing was popular because it facilitated easy comparison. I suspect that the users would have included artisans, modern calligraphers seeking source material. But it's also clear that these publications had art historical scholarly audiences as well, as my own copy, which you're seeing here, illustrates. You can see that this card has been annotated. And it gives the folio location for each initials, is very handy, the biblical book, and the colors of the initials and related decorations. Some of the cards also list the color of the text. Here, the note lists the colors in the interlaced ornament that fills the letter. This copy was deaccessioned from the Fine Arts Library at the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard. And every plate is annotated like this, in one hand throughout, with a kind of attention and detail that suggests a professional eye. I wonder if this was a librarian annotating the black and white images to make them more useful, or perhaps a renegade professor of art history, maybe a later collector. Whoever it is, this is also a person with their own tastes and ideas. The notes on the second eye in the left image include a description of the bands of black text on green ground and gold on purple bands, concluding that the green is not very effective. I don't think it's that bad myself. But green is one of those colors that people can see very differently. And then on the right, the description begins gold, green, purple with the addendum bluish for once. I can sympathize. There's a lot of green and purple in Latin 1, and this initial does stand out. The point is that someone's carefully making these black and white images useful in the context of the study of them as art objects, and presumably consulting a much later color photographic facsimile to do so. But there's still a very human element of taste, pleasure, irritation, exasperation, and colors the site where we can see those things at work. Throughout this talk, I've been exploring the limitations of color reproduction as being in part about fundamental differences with respect to the purpose of facsimile. Is a copy of an illuminated manuscript intended to facilitate study and comparison? Is it a template for imitation? Is it intended to spark memory, emotion, connection? Is color incidental or central to any or all of these purposes? And we can look at one last cluster, again focused on a famous manuscript with a long history of reproduction, the Book of Kells. In 1892, Trinity College Library published two collections of photographic images from its most famous manuscript. The first, Celtic Ornaments from the Book of Kells, was published in parts, each with black and white photographic plates, very minimal commentary. Advertising for the series made it clear the color was not imagined. Quote, "No attempt will be made to reproduce the color, as it is believed that to do so by any mechanical process would be impossible. The attempts hitherto made have proved unmitigated failures, but by the use of the isochromatic method, the proper balance of light and shade can be to some extent preserved." The unmitigated failure referred to here is probably the recent attempt to use photozincography in the Facsimiles of National Manuscripts of Ireland to reproduce the manuscript. So this came out between 1874 and 1884. And this is the Cairo page as it was presented in that collection. Westwood, our buddy, reviewed this publication and declared photozincography, which was yet another early photographic method, this one pioneered by the UK's Ordnance Survey in its publication of Domesday Book. Westwood declared photozincography entirely unsuited for illuminated interlaced manuscripts, such as the Book of Kells. Hand coloring had been used inexpertly, he felt, to deal with some of the defects, resulting in what he called a confused mass. Yet despite the 1892 publication's deliberate attempt to avoid similar charges by using monochrome photographic reproduction, the volumes were not well received. A review of the Book of Kells fascicles and the single-volume Examples of Celtic Ornament reduced from the Books of Kells and Durrow decried the depressing cloud of murky obscurity and wondered whether pen and ink copies of detail might not have been more useful. Similarly, the reviewer for the Journal of the Royal Society of Antiquaries of Ireland asked why, if color could not be reproduced, the publications were perpetuating the, quote, chromatic defects of photography, instead of giving outlines that would be more useful to students of art. So what's being imagined there is something like the antiquarian and artist Margaret Stokes's early Christian art in Ireland, whose purpose, she said, was to educate workers in the present day. At the same time, this pragmatic approach is accompanied by marvel at the original, as Stokes writes, "No copy of such a work as this can convey an idea of perfection of execution shown in the original. For as with the skeleton of a leaf, or with any microscopic work of nature, the stronger the magnifying power brought to bear upon it, the more is this perfection revealed." Stokes's own abilities were the subject of marvels for others. Westwood pointed to her full-page chromolithograph of the Cairo page as being far superior to the photozincographic reproduction in the Facsimiles of National Manuscripts of Ireland. So here he is saying that the photozincographic cannot do what needs to be done and referring his reader to Stokes's piece of work, which is indeed remarkable. This is my photograph from my own copy. It's also massive. And size is another element that facsimilists grapple with. Stokes regretted the need to show detail only in her early Christian art, thanks to the book's small size. And that second publication from Trinity in 1892 is, as it notes parenthetically, perhaps apologetically, on the title page of Reduced Examples. Now, I've said that these 1892 publications were not particularly well received by critics, but there's a story attached to this image that returns us to the realm of the very human. This is my own copy of Examples. It was, in its origin, a plain and inexpensive book, published in soft covers, imagined as a souvenir. Quote, "It is thought that those who have had their admiration excited by the inspection of the manuscript itself may be glad to have their recollection of it assisted by these reduced illustrations," the preface suggests. My copy has been rebound in cheap leather, with a gold-stamped title on the cover, garish green marbled inner boards, the front bearing the bookplate of Archibald Charles Campbell and Emmeline Campbell. Between the introduction and the photographs are 6 red frame pages, partially filled with careful handwritten notes about the manuscripts. And these have been taken verbatim from the account of Facsimiles of National Manuscripts of Ireland, which was the companion volume to the maligned photozincographic reproductions I've just mentioned. But the writer also adds some additional commentary, noting, for example, that the Book of Durrow is daily exhibited under glass in the long room of the Library of Trinity College beside the Book of Kells. At night, both are locked up in a fireproof safe. There's no actual color on these pages, but the act of turning the pamphlet into a more elevated kind of keepsake suggests again an imaginative encounter, as a user supplements a facsimile to recreate an idea of the source manuscript, even when the facsimile itself has been found wanting. A later owner of this particular volume added a penciled note in the front, dated 1960, which reads, "Manuscript and actual photographs gives me the urge to see them in color." A final thought. All the images I've shown today have, of course, themselves been reproductions. Some are my photographs, freely manipulated to get the tonal balance that I want. Some are screen grabs from digitization. Some are institutionally supplied digital photographs. We're all used to the color scales and rulers that accompany modern state-of-the-art digitization. So this is a carpet page from the British Library's digitization of the Lindisfarne Gospels. But the gap between that information and how we use, or perhaps more importantly, how we relate to the image, remains. In the 1920s, the German historian and librarian Georg Leidinger sponsored a massive chromolithographed facsimile of the Codex Aureus of St. Emmeram. It was printed on glossy art paper, a choice necessitated by the fact that the matte paper, which in Leidinger's view better matched the texture of parchment, swallowed up the luminosity of the color. The makers had to choose between one sense and another, and the choice did not sit entirely comfortably with them. Today, we have ready access to any number of digitizations, both of the printed facsimiles I've been dealing with here and the institutional presentations of their originals. But we're still looking at intervening surfaces, for us screens, rather than, say, glossy paper, as we attempt to look through to the objects of the past. And I'd suggest that our own feelings, unser eigenes Gefühl, which can mean both professional disciplinary assessment and personal imaginative connection, are still in play, as they have been through the long prehistory of our present moment. Thank you. I think I will stop sharing and hope that I come back. Yes, good.
Thank you so much. That was just great. Um, everything everything I wanted and more. I don't know. Folks in the audience, if you have questions, you can raise your hand if you want to unmute and ask, or you can type your questions in the chat, and either I or my colleague Nick will pass it along. And already Lisa Fagan Davis has her hand
right
up,
in
so
there.
I'll just let Lisa go.
me, call on me, pick me. Hi, Siân, how are you?
Hi,
It's
Lisa.
nice to
I'm
see
fine,
you.
thanks.
This was so fantastic. That's such an interesting project and way of thinking about the history of reproduction and how we engage with these objects. I was really struck by looking at the facsimiles that are alphabets or that are little, bits of from the margin. It feels so similar to me to what biblioclasts like Ruskin were doing, where they
Yes.
were cutting out initials and sticking them into little scrapbooks and grangerizing things. And do you see conceptually a similarity there that this is all happening in that same time period, right? We're in the 19th century and we're seeing that the interest in the piece as much as the whole. Or is there a
Yeah,
connection there, or is it just coincidence, do you think?
no, I think it's a connection, but I think it actually goes further back than the 19th century. The first chapter of the book, I talk about treatment of the manuscript letter and the beginnings of what becomes paleography. And I go all the way back to Mabillon. And quite, we understand why plates that are intended to illustrate the history of script would be made up of samples and alphabets from dated and datable manuscripts, right?
Mhm.
But that sort of establishes an early way of thinking, an early kind of extractive approach to the manuscript page. So you extract the letters. Um, then you get more in the 19th century, you get, well, late 18th, early 19th, you get things like the beginnings of history of costume. So Joseph Strutt's important in that regard. And again, I mean, he's extracting, but what he's extracting are datable images of clothing, right? And then by the time you hit the period of scrapbooking and grangerization and amateur medievalism, you already
Mhm.
have a kind of well-established approach to the manuscript page that says you take whatever bits of it are of interest to you.
Oh,
Right.
interesting. Yeah. Thank you. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
All right. I don't see anyone else with their hands up. I have a question though, and I think it's related a little bit maybe to Lisa's question. And as you were speaking, especially sort of towards the end, you made reference to how people were using these things that were being created. But I'm a little bit curious, and maybe because it's because of some current work that I'm doing in terms of making my own little facsimiles and playing around with them in different ways. I'm wondering how the people who were making them, particularly I think Shaw, they were very beautiful, and I'm
Yeah.
wondering, did they think of themselves as artists, or were they academics, or do you have any sense
Well,
of what they felt about that?
I mean, this is one of the things that I found so interesting about the project because retrospectively, people will write about people like Joseph Strutt or, or later Shaw as being in at the ground floor of what's going to become art history, right? So at the beginning, like these guys did develop senses of schools of art, of and very often this had a sort of a nationalist cast too. Like I was talking here about
Mm.
the English approach, but there's a lot of French material which is really very similar and um, that's interested in part in constructing a national artistic history, and then this sort of intersects with history as well. Um, Strutt thought of himself as many things. He thought of himself as an historian. He tried writing a complete chronicle history of England. It wasn't particularly successful because it wasn't as lavishly illustrated as other books. But he thought of himself as what we might describe as something like a social historian. He was interested in games and culture and clothing and that sort of thing. Um, Shaw also thinks of himself as a kind of historian. I mean, he's an artist. He makes his living as an artist. But the books that he includes what we would think of as history, what we would think of as literary history, as part of how he tells again, as part of how he constructs his narrative about visual culture and visual design. Um, I think in a way the 19th century is challenging for our particular descriptions, our sort of tendency to sort of separate artist, scholar, artisan, artist. I mean, what is somebody like William Morris, right? He's all of those things. And I think that's where many of them position themselves. But retrospectively, many of them, like even Dibdin, for all of the ridiculous excesses of his language, is now recognized as one of the first people who took seriously the idea that there were developed schools of medieval manuscript painting, right? So they might have simply have described themselves as lovers of the medieval past, but what they did fed into what become our disciplines.
Right. Okay. Thank you. That's really helpful. So there is a question in the chat from Andrea Nunez. Hi, Andrea. Can you briefly describe how you manipulate the digital images to achieve the desired colors within the images? I think this is in reference to your, yeah.
Yeah. No, seriously, I use standard image editors, and I mean, what I can say is that most often, so in the bit about George Warner, who mentions William Griggs, who's the English chromolithographer who oversaw the chromolithography for the 1903 British Museum Library chromolithographs. He talks about Griggs's careful collation. And it is still the case even today, Giovanni can tell you this, that modern producers of facsimiles, the last thing they do after the photographic reproduction and everything is eyeball the original and adjust. And that's what I do. And I mostly tend to find that the images that I'm looking at on my screen appear to me to be oversaturated. So the most common adjustment I make is to reduce color saturation to match what my eye sees. But like I said, when talking about green and blue, like we know scientifically, we don't all see color the same way. So I just play with the slide in Photoshop.
Great. Thanks.
Peter.
Peter has his hand up.
Yeah. Hi. Let me I'm really here.
I see you.
I have a librarian's question.
Oh, good.
The set of cards that were discarded by the Fogg Library
Yes.
with their wonderful annotations, and they found their way to the one person best equipped to make use of those annotations. I assume you bought them at a used book.
I did.
Online
I bought them from Abe Books.
Yeah, and that's great. Do you see, so many books are being discarded now, and physical collections are being toned down, and libraries have last copy agreements with each other to be sure that no one discards the very last physical copy of a given book. How do you feel about that? And do you see continuity from the biblioclasts on through to the current age?
Well, I think whether there's continuity, I don't know that they would want to describe themselves as biblioclasts exactly, but
No.
my copy of that 1911 collection is marked as copy 2. And I'm assuming that probably what happened was they had 2 of them, and probably one of them somebody had written all over, and the other one somebody hadn't written all over. So they kept the one that wasn't written all over. But from my perspective, the thing that is most interesting is that somebody wrote all over it, right? And I think, you know what it does connect to? It connects to the idea of the facsimile as reproducing, what the facsimile is supposed to do is reproduce some original state, not the state of the thing as it now is. And I mean, sure, would be nice to see the original state of things, but the state of the thing as it now is also full of information. And so if you don't reproduce that, then you're missing something. So every time you throw out a book, you potentially throw out a whole story about how people use that book and how they imagine themselves in the field that book represents.
Yeah.
Don't do it, librarians. Hold on to all your books. Okay,
No matter how
so
much
it's a
it
storage
costs.
problem.
Yeah, no, yeah, thank you. That frames it really well.
I have a question, Sean. Thank you for this wonderful talk. Actually, many questions and sort of follow-ups. But I wanted to go back to Ernesto Sprega, who you started with, and I
Yeah.
was very happy that you showed that small sample of his work that was donated to us a few years ago, which is really interesting. And I was wondering, I mean, his whatever you call them, reproductions, replicas, like perhaps not our example that we have at Penn, but the ones at the V&A, the Sienna choir books are really incredible from a sort of artistic
Yeah.
point of view and a sort of fidelity point of view. And I was wondering, I mean, how does the hand painted facsimile figure into this? I mean, it's obviously expensive. It's perhaps the V&A and some other institutions, I would imagine, had these samples of Sprague and other people's. I'm thinking of like Caleb Wing, who,
Yeah.
repaired and forged things, but with great, I would say, from my point of view, fidelity and um, um, to the original. Um, is that and I'm thinking of something like the image from our collection that you showed and that we used to promote your talk. How would that item have been used? I mean, it's a small sort of sample, as you showed. It's been sort of excerpted and cleaned up, and I don't know if we have much information about how those hand painted replicas were distributed,
No.
collected.
I mean, so when I was working on Henry Shaw and I was in the print room at the V&A, they had many, many years ago, Rowan Watson had done an exhibition of facsimile leaves, and they gave me a copy of the like mimeographed, that's how long ago it was, of the catalog. And one of the things that catalog that he noted was that when the South Kensington Museum bought those leaves, they actually paid more for them than they paid for a lot of medieval materials. Like
Right, right.
the val and Shaw's exhibition, which was in Piccadilly, apparently was a huge success, and people paid to go see this exhibition. Um, Shaw said that part of what he was doing was part of what he was doing was deliberately protecting the manuscripts in the British Library Museum because they were being used as source material by art students. But also he was filling in what he saw as gaps in the V&A's own collection because they had a collection of well, Lisa can talk about this at length. They had a collection of leaves, right? But as you would expect, a lot of what they had was Italian and Spanish and so on, and from choir books, because that's what there was. So he deliberately made these copies in part to give a more comprehensive sense of the development of illumination. Um, and this is a period that sees the publication of dozens of manuals of illumination, of calligraphic manuals directed at amateurs and also artists. And they often, I mean, there's this kind of, circulation of the same images, right? So one image will get published and then it gets plagiarism is obviously not a problem. It gets reused over and over and over again across a range of things. So we know that they were used as for education. The actual technical business of how, the only hint I have is not about the hand painted leaves, but the Grimani Breviary. Or is it the Grimani Breviary? No, it's some famous manuscript, which of course is completely left my brain now. Um, that that was deeply guarded. You couldn't go and see it without being someone, and you had to have somebody standing over your shoulder and so on. And there was an antiquarian who said, really, what we should be doing is taking it apart and mounting the leaves in glass, in panels, so that they could be seen and that way they could be consulted, right? It didn't happen, but it tells you something about how people were imagining they might want to make use of either the originals or, in Shaw's case, materials. And when you go to the V&A now, you pull those glass panels out and they're full of samples. So I'm assuming it was similar, but I don't know for sure.
I remember many, many years ago, actually, when I was a child at going to the Cluny Museum in Paris for the first time, and there was I don't know what's become of it. It'll be interesting to see, but it's certainly not there anymore. But there was a kind of glass binder of actual cuttings that you could sort of step up and
Yeah.
look at, glass and metal sort of three-ring binder thing, which I'm sure from a conservation perspective is not. But yeah, it's fascinating. Thank you. That's fascinating.
Let's see, any other questions? There is a sad story. I won't read it, but if you look in the chat, everyone, there's this sad story about a deaccessioning of some art books from a
Oh,
library, which is very
that is sad.
upsetting. So I'm sorry. That's unfortunate.
I have a semi-formulated question, so forgive me if I'm slightly rambly, but thank you for a very interesting talk. I've recently been reading Tolkien's Farmer Giles of Ham to my 4-year-old son, which is illustrated by Pauline Baynes, she's a generation or so later than the people you've been talking about mostly, but she's playing on this same kind of idea of like reproducing, facsimile form of medieval text, but for fiction, but to give it kind of that aura of truth. And so I'm curious, if you see any interplay of this, of the facsimile, manuscript facsimile, sort of forming a bridge, maybe, both between the authenticating side that you were speaking about and also a granting of authenticity side, if that
Yeah,
makes sense.
sure. I mean, if you think about things like the fine press movement at the end of the century, right? The deliberate adoption of 15th, 16th century printing techniques and designs in books that nevertheless are never going to fool anybody. I mean, you don't pick up a Kelmscott book and think that you're looking at a 16th century print, right? And while, say, if you're reading the Kelmscott Chaucer, you're reading Chaucer, that same kind of presentation gets used for William Morris's own writing or other kinds of things. So the tendency to decorate medievalizing texts with use the word authenticating. I think that's right. Images that are meant to kind of suggest this is somehow connected, right? This is somehow the real deal, and you can tell because we've got this medieval. I mean, we still do it. We clip initials and use them as drop caps on websites or put them on our editions of medieval texts, all of that kind of thing. So I do think there is a crossover. I meant to say in response to Nick that one of the things that's interesting about Sprague and Caleb Wing, whom you also mentioned, is that a lot of these guys who were doing this kind of very careful reproduction, a lot of it crossed over into forgery. And there were, in addition, Caleb Wing was hired to finish medieval books that hadn't been finished. Like he would, how you get a book that has blank initials or blank illuminations, and he would finish them because then they were, more popular. And there was a time when, end of the 19th and into the beginning of the 20th century, when there was a lot of forged material of this sort floating around. Uh, the Spanish forgers, another famous example of that. So on the one hand, you've got the totally acknowledged authenticating gesture. But then on the other hand, there's all kinds of practices going on with respect, and in libraries too, right? Like libraries, custodians' ideas about what they owed to their materials and what constitutes restoration, for example, was very different in earlier periods than it might be now. So it's a muddle, like this whole question of what counts as real or authentic.
Yeah, I think that line between restoration and forgery is really interesting. And like as a person working in a manuscripts collection, it's always really actually fun to like find those things. So thank you for mentioning that. Are there any other questions? We're almost to the end, but we still have time if there's more questions or comments. No? Okay. Well, that was just wonderful. And thank you, Siân, for presenting this wonderful talk. And thank you everyone for your great questions and conversation. And is there like an official sign off that we have to do, Lynn, or do we just say?
See you next time. See
Everybody
you
leave
April
now.
17th.
See you April 17th, everyone.
And
thank
Sean.
you.
That was
Okay.
really
Thanks
wonderful.
everyone for
Yeah.
coming. Thanks for your questions. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.